China has weaponized its critical minerals monopoly on which the entire Western industrial base depends. According to European Council of Foreign Relations expert Dr. Tobias Gerke, this dependency is even worse than Europe's 2021 dependence on Russian gas, which led to a massive energy crisis in 2022. So if China cuts its critical minerals completely today,
our industry is not prepared. Vast elements of our base industry in Europe, but also in other places, rely on access to permanent magnets, most importantly. So if that would stop tomorrow, quite frankly, some of these industries, like the automotive industry, would grind to a halt. There would be no more production very quickly. That would have incredible cascading effects. Imagine that. 13 million people are employed in the car industry in Europe. Imagine 95% of them would stop production. I mean, we're talking an economic crisis of historic proportions.
No wonder governments ranging from Europe to the US to India are scrambling to reduce their dependence on Chinese minerals like rare earths, copper and lithium. But this will be incredibly hard. China's mineral monopoly is protected by its massive scale, massive government subsidies, lax environmental regulations, and
China churns out hundreds of thousands of academics and PhDs in mining and geology, and in Europe it's a drop in the ocean. And so even if you now want to reverse this, the deck is stacked against us.
But there is hope for the West. In the 1980s and 1990s, the West dominated all of these industries, and China was able to break through the Western monopoly through clever policies. So, can the West learn from China to take back its sovereignty? Yes, absolutely. In this video, I'll show you how they can do it in 5 steps. But before getting into the specifics, let's do a quick recap of why critical minerals are so important. For simplicity, let's start with the critical minerals that have been in the news the most.
We are discussing critical minerals and rare earths.
Probably heard people talking recently about rare earths.
What is so special about these rare earths? Sure, the F-35 jet, state-of-the-art US Navy destroyer, nuclear attack submarines, I found they all contain thousands of pounds of rare earths. But what for?
The main product that is made out of refined rare earths is our permanent magnets.
These magnets that do not need an external power source to generate their magnetic field, they allow modern wind turbines, for example, to transform wind into electricity. They are at the core of loudspeakers, microphones and all of our headphones. The new Nintendo Switch 2 has super snappy magnetic attachments that sound like this. Sounds good, but perhaps more crucially, modern cars cannot be made without permanent magnets. They power your car's trunk sensor, your car's steering system, its air conditioning actuator, the window lifting motor, and for electric vehicles, even its entire motor. So this is why it really matters that
China holds a global share of rare earth refining and permanent magnet production, somewhere around 95%.
And worryingly, China has recently introduced a licensing system that requires any firm in the world to apply for a Chinese license to use these magnets.
You need to go to Beijing and say, hello, I'm Volkswagen, I need that permanent magnet, do I get a license?
If Beijing says no, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Ford, the entire Western car industry grounds to a halt. And even if they can replace all the permanent magnets all over Western cars, that will be so expensive that they would soon be crushed by competitors that do have a license from Beijing. China has already shown that it is willing to use economic weapons like this to devastate local industries. For example, in 2023, China no longer granted Chinese firms licenses to export graphite to Sweden. It wasn't exactly clear why it did this, but publications like The Economist have mentioned that it may have been triggered when a Swedish free speech group gave an award to a Chinese dissident. Although the reason could also have been strategic. For a while, Sweden's promising battery startup Northvolt seemed like the only company that could be competitive against Chinese producers. But 2 years after China's ban, Sweden's Northvolt shut its door for good in Sweden. Only 10 to 15 years ago, this would be unthinkable. Back then, the dominant idea was that the global free market just determines everything. If a battery company wants to buy minerals and it is in short supply, the price will just go up for everyone at the same time. And the highest bidder, well, they will buy. The only job of the government was to let the free market function as efficiently as possible. This logic no longer works today. Governments are increasingly realizing their role is no longer just about making markets efficient. It's also about protecting domestic industries from foreign manipulation. Therefore, governments have now been forced to think carefully about critical minerals and critical materials more broadly, which are defined as any materials that have, number one, a high risk of supply chain disruption, and number two, serve an essential function in one or more technologies. By this definition, rare earths are clearly a critical material. China now has a massive power over foreign manufacturing firms because it has a monopoly or near monopoly in the two other parts of the supply chain, mining and refining. On average, China controls 54% of rare earth mining, but far more importantly, it controls about 77% of rare earth refining. This is the pattern that we see all across industries that power the modern, increasingly electrified global economy. For example, if we look at copper, which is the main conductor of electricity, we can see that mining is relatively diversified. Even though Chile, the Congo and Peru are the biggest producers. But when it comes to refining, China is much more dominant. But the West's critical material vulnerability is not purely limited to China. Take for example nickel, which is a key input in steel production, and it is one of the most promising metals to be used in batteries. However, supply is not secure at all, given that Indonesia is the epicenter of global nickel production and now also refinement. You see, like China, Indonesia has shown that it is more than willing to use its nickel dominance as an economic weapon, as it has banned all raw nickel exports to ensure that it also dominates the nickel refinement industry. However, so far, China has smartly moved in to make sure many of the best Indonesian-based nickel refineries are in fact Chinese companies. But nickel is a rare exception where a country other than China dominates. If we look at the most common element used in batteries, lithium, we can again see that in mining, sure, China is a big player, but Australia is actually more important. However, Australian mines largely depend on Chinese refining capacity, making Western battery manufacturers again largely dependent on China. This pattern holds for almost all critical minerals, graphite, cobalt, you name it. Mining dominance is different per mineral, even if China almost always plays a big role. But the real story is about refinery. China dominates almost all critical mineral refinery, giving it an insanely powerful economic weapon that it is now starting to use to get both Western and non-Western countries like India to do what it wants. But before we get to how the West can respond, this of course raises the question, why is China so dominant in mineral refinement? Because it really wasn't always like this. Just a few decades ago, in fact, after the Second World War, the dominant rare earth player was actually the United States, thanks to the massive Mountain Pass mines in California. So ironically, as US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently said,
the technology, especially in rare earth magnets, that's being used against us, it was US technology.
But Japan and Europe also played a major role.
France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, all of them had strong mineral mining industries and know-how.
So what happened? How did the Chinese take over this strategic industry? The answer actually consists of two parts. The first part is Chinese strategy. Interestingly, there are some rumors that China's rare earth monopoly was a result of a grand geoeconomic strategy set out already by Deng Xiaoping in 1992. But according to Mihaly Roiby, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is doing her doctoral research on China's rare earth monopoly, China's current dominance is probably and ironically a result of industrial protection by Japan and the US in the 1990s, which excluded Chinese firms from obtaining the know-how to refine critical minerals. Now, to counter this, they were forced to
attract a lot of foreign investment and talent and know-how into the mineral space.
Mostly from Europe, and they did this by giving foreigners all sorts of juicy advantages like
tax credits, it gave lax environmental protection.
Crucially, the Europeans let them do this. Why? Well, two reasons. The first is the increasingly dominant free market philosophy in the 1990s. If European firms could produce more cheaply in China, then of course they were free to do it. The second reason was environmental protection. You see, refining critical minerals is really a really dirty business.
You will need a lot of big chemical mix to clean, to wash off the actual mineral that you want.
The 1990s was also a time of rising environmental regulations in the West. Western firms could dodge these regulations by moving to China, and politicians were actually quite happy to be rid of these highly pollutive industries. Bye-bye. However, just as with Western car firms moving to China, the Chinese had regulations in place that all foreign firms needed to set up local joint ventures where they had to transfer knowledge to China if they wanted to work cheaply in China. The thing is, businesses care about profits in the next couple of years. They do not strategize about competition in 40 years' time. So they happily move their production to China. But today, after 3 or 4 decades, just as German car manufacturers now struggle to compete with the Chinese firms, the rare earth mining and especially refinery business is now dominated by Chinese firms, giving the Chinese government their incredibly powerful economic weapon. So of course, Western governments are now struggling to respond, and actually, it may be too late, for at least 4 reasons. Environmental regulations, this is number 1, are still much stricter in the West than in China. Reason number 2, Chinese firms now have massive scale advantages. Reason number 3, Chinese firms in strategic sectors are often heavily subsidized by the government if they need it. And then finally, number 4,
China churns out hundreds of thousands of academics and PhDs in mining and geology, and in Europe it's a drop in the ocean. Yeah, and so even if you now want to reverse this, the deck is stacked against us.
And yet the deck was also stacked against China in the 1990s, when all of the know-how and technology was in the West. So what can the West learn from China? Here's how the West should respond. And actually, this is not just applicable to the West. It's applicable to any country that wants to remain independent in the new age of geoeconomics, where great powers, including those in the West, I have to say, will not hesitate to use economic weapons to achieve political goals. Any country that wants sovereignty in this age needs a grand geoeconomic strategy in which they set themselves a goal for how independent they want to be. Importantly, such a strategy is not just about critical minerals. It considers oil, it considers cloud computing, infrastructure, it considers an entire economy. Having a grand geoeconomic strategy does not mean every country should be independent in everything, given that complete independence is often simply impossible and in all cases extremely inefficient. So any Western strategy should focus on achieving the right balance between full free market type specialization and autarky. For critical minerals, this means the following. Step number 1 is that Western governments should learn from China, who is, by the way, already stockpiling oil, grain and even pork, that in the age of geoeconomics, every nation needs some buffers, in this case of critical minerals. For the most part, Western governments are already starting to do this or planning to do this. Step number 2. Most Western governments need to realize that gaining some more independence from Chinese minerals can best be done in a big alliance. Europe and Japan don't have many minerals, but they do have some know-how left, and they have lots of money to invest. Australia and Canada have lots of minerals, but they almost completely rely on Chinese refineries. Therefore, Western governments like Japan and Australia, Canada and the EU, and the US and Australia, and many more, are already forming mineral alliances between individual countries. But in my opinion, these individual alliances are likely much less effective than a concerted big group effort. Just as NATO as a big alliance is far more effective than a patchwork of defensive alliances between individual states, a mineral alliance is also far more effective if it is big. Still, even with a very big alliance, step number 3 is needed. We know that Chinese industrial advantages are now just too big for private Western companies to overcome. On top of that, as Scott Bessent recently said,
anytime anyone tries to stand up one of these rare earths critical mineral facilities, Chinese come in, they flood the market.
In other words, the Chinese state is actively coordinating its industry to prevent foreign competition from rising. Therefore, a free market approach just will not work. Instead, governments need to study and copy China's industrial policy approach. As a group, they should use industrial policy tools like subsidies, price floors, and tariffs to help the mineral mining and, crucially, refinery industries recover in allied countries. On top of that, in step number 4, Western countries should use industrial policy tools like subsidies and tariffs strategically to speed up the development of alternative and recycling technologies as well. And yes, this is already happening. For example, France is building a massive magnet recycling plant in the south. And when it comes to technological replacement, BMW, and Renault are already experimenting with new electric motors that do not rely on rare earths. But these are just small initiatives. There is no big strategic effort yet. The potential of Chinese retaliation then brings us to step 5. Western countries should develop a portfolio of other technologies and materials on which China relies, and they should create a doctrine that determines what happens if any ally faces a geo-economic attack. Because even mineral-poor regions, like Europe, are not powerless.
Imagine Europe would say in response to China threatening to cut rare earths, imagine Europe would respond and say, and then we will cut off the maintenance and servicing of Airbus aircraft in China. It would be huge.
Similarly, like Russia did in 2020, China holds almost all of its financial reserves in Western currencies. So, in this step 5, it's clear that there is enough leverage in the West to make a doctrine that essentially makes clear in geoeconomic terms that
if you do X, I will do Y. And our Y needs to be very large and painful, because you want to escalate in order to de-escalate.
And while of course it is clear that when it comes to critical minerals, these 5 steps are intended to counter China. But I personally think Western countries should develop their geoeconomic strategy not just to target critical minerals and also not just to target China. We have to be honest, China is not unique in using geoeconomic weapons to get others to do what they want. Under Trump, the US is doing this as well, and as we've seen throughout history, the West has done this from time to time as well. But yeah, that's my take. Have I been unfair to China? Do these steps make any sense? Am I forgetting something? Let me know in the comments below. And if you are interested in in-depth follow-up analysis, I highly recommend you check out our advertising sponsor, The Economist. Specifically, I recommend you check out this detailed analysis about how China's licensing system is actually using America's own trade weapons to beat it. Then follow up with this analysis about why China's power over rare earths may not be as great as it seems. And finally, how all of this so far means that arguably China is winning the trade war. These kind of detailed, balanced analysis are exactly why I highly recommend you subscribe to The Economist, which now offers an exclusive 35% discount for Money Macro viewers. Whether you prefer their app, podcasts and newsletters, or whether you are like me and prefer to catch up on the global economy during the weekend, sitting down with a nice cup of coffee and the paper edition, you'll always stay on top of the latest global developments no matter where you are. So don't miss out. Click the link in the description or top comment below, or head over to economist.com/moneymacro to claim your exclusive 35% discount today.